Hello and welcome back. For this lecture, you're in for a real treat. We're going to go ahead and begin a new system called the skeletal system. This is a very complex system, lots of parts involved, but we'll spend somewhere around 3 weeks studying this and learning about all the parts. I think you'll enjoy this system. It's one of my favorite systems, so let's go ahead and we'll get into it. So the skeletal system is basically initially cartilage and fibrous membranes, and then it's converted over into what you know of as the hard tissue that you know of as bone. By the age of 25, the skeleton is completely hardened, and it's no longer growing in length, but it can change in width and girth. So there's 206 bones in the adult skeleton. This makes up about 20% of the body mass. And 80 bones are found in what we call the axial skeleton. This is the skeleton that comprises your things like your skull, your vertebral column, and then there's 126 bones of the appendicular skeleton, and this would include like your appendages and such as your arms and legs. So we'll be learning all these bones, and we'll spend a lot of time in lab going over these particular parts. So the skeletal system has a lot of different jobs. Probably you're more familiar with its job as being a supporting structure. It does aid in protection. So if you imagine your cranium, it completely encloses your brain and protects the brain. The rib cage does a pretty good job of protecting many of your vital internal organs. So in regards to movement, the skeleton provides leverage points for muscles to grab a hold of, and when those muscles contract, they can pull the muscles. Your skeletal system is also involved in producing red blood cells and white blood cells, and also platelets. So inside a substance called red bone marrow is where those particular cells are produced, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So calcium and phosphorus are maintained in homeostasis in your bloodstream, and they're stored in the skeletal system. When you have excessive amounts of those, they can be stored in the bones, and when you need them, they can be released from the bones. So the skeletal system is definitely involved in mineral homeostasis. Inside of your long bones of your body, you also store triglycerides. Triglycerides are, if you remember back to our macromolecule lecture, these are fats, so you can store a lot of energy within your bones and then release those stored nutrients when you need them. So this is just a graphic showing you the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So you can see that the axial skeleton is kind of these the orange bones, and then the more whitish yellowish bones would be part of the appendicular skeleton. So if you look at these blue parts are where you have hyaline cartilage. So you have hyaline cartilage in between your bones, and the ribs. So making up the part that connects your rib bones to your sternum. So and then we have fibrocartilage that is going to be in the symphysis pubis and the intervertebral discs. So, and we have various elastic cartilages around as well. So bone is a connective tissue made from a framework of collagen fibers with a hardened matrix around those collagen fibers. You can literally take and dissolve all the minerals out of your bone and still have the collagen fiber matrix, and it'll look just like the real bone. In lab, I'll show you some of those that have been put in acid so you can see what those feel like. So calcium phosphate and calcium hydroxide, these particular molecules interact with each other, and they form crystals of this material called hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite crystals will incorporate other materials such as calcium carbonate, sodium ions, magnesium ions, and fluoride, and they'll make the bone really strong and hard. So this was what I was talking to you about before. So this is the bone matrix. This is made of the collagenous fibers. But if you take and you digest all the hydroxyapatite crystals out of it, you can actually flex the bones, yet they still maintain the general shape of the bone because of the collagen fibers. So your bone is made of a lot of protein in the form of collagen. So bone tissue has a lot of different kinds of cells that are embedded inside of the matrix. You have osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are stem cells that will produce new bone cells. We also have osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are matrix synthesizing cells, and they're responsible for bone growth. We have osteocytes, which are mature bone cells. These cells will sit inside of mature bone and maintain the composition of the bone. They monitor it, and then if they need to dissolve the bone or make more bone, they can aid in doing those particular things. And then we have osteoclasts, which are bone reabsorbing cells. So you can see there's a side over here that has a lot, almost looks like microvilli, and these will sit inside of bone and digest it. We'll talk about how it releases chemicals and digests the bone, and then it absorbs the bone material and sends it into the bloodstream. These osteoclasts are really important because they help you to put calcium and phosphates back into the bloodstream, and they're important too because they help you to remodel the bone and change its shape. Okay, so we have bone building cells, we have bone destroying cells, mature bone cells, and then stem cells to give us new bone cells. And these are just showing some different locations where these bone cells might be. So osteogenic cells are going to be in various locations, but in this particular graphic it's in the endosteum, and which is the inner lining of the inside of the bone. Mature bone cells are going to be in the actual bone material. And then we have osteoclast and osteoblast. Osteoblasts a lot of times are on the outside where you can grow new bone. Osteoclasts a lot of times are on the inside in the endosteum where you can digest the bone and release it to the bloodstream. So I'm going to talk about the parts of a long bone, and I'll go ahead and kind of outline them here and then give you some written notes so that you can go back and study and perhaps make flashcards or something of that nature. So we have a lot of long bones in our body, and this particular long bone is the humerus, but we also have the radius ulna and the femur and the tibia and fibula down in the lower leg. So each of these long bones has some parts that are in common. So at the ends of the bones, we have the proximal epiphysis. So, this is the one that's close to the attachment point, and then the distal epiphysis is the part of the bone, the expanded end of the bone that's further away from the attachment point. Epiphyses would be plural, epiphysis is singular. So these are just the ends of the bones, and we just name everything in the human body, and this is the name that we give the ends of the bones. So the middle of the bone is called the diaphysis, and then in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis would be the metaphysis. So this is just a region, it's kind of a mid-region between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So let me go and talk about some of the parts you might see in the epiphyses. So we do have articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is going to be found on either end, and this cartilage is a hyaline cartilage that cushions the impact of bone on bone. And it's very tough, it's very hard, it's hard to even cut with a knife, and we'll see some of that in lab when we do the chicken wing dissection. So articular cartilage is really important. When it breaks down or becomes ossified, you have arthritis, and that's a very painful condition when the articular cartilage wears out. So kind of moving in, we have this material called spongy bone. You can see it kind of looks like a sponge, and it's found throughout the epiphysis and metaphysis. And this contains the red bone marrow where you produce red blood cells. You also produce platelets and white blood cells in that material as well. So the red bone marrow is found in the spongy bone, and then we have also an epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line is a growth line where growth will actually occur in terms of growth and length will occur, for young children, up into the 20s for males. So moving on down into the diaphysis, here the artist has cut it in a cross-sectional view, so you can actually a longitudinal view, so you can see inside of it. And you'll see that there is this material here called compact bone. This is very, very tough bone, and it makes up kind of like the wall of the shaft of the bone. In lining that compact bone on the inside is the endosteum. And you can see they've pulled a little piece of it away there for you to see, so you can see it as a connective tissue layer. And then there's a cavity called the medullary cavity that is inside of the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is actually hollow. The walls of the diaphysis is made of compact bone, and it's lined by endosteum. So you do have all kinds of nutrient arteries that feed, bring blood vessels into and feed the bone. And we have yellow marrow in adults. So this medullary cavity would be full of triglyceride that would be yellowish and makes up what we call the yellow marrow. That's a stored nutrient inside of the bone. On the outside of the bone, we have the periosteum. And this will be a connective tissue that surrounds the whole bone, and we'll see its job in just a few minutes. So if you didn't get that, let's go ahead and take a few written notes. So the diaphysis is that tubular shaft that forms the long axis of the bone, and the walls of it are made of compact bone, and it surrounds and makes up the medullary cavity. The epiphyses are the bone ends, and these are the outside of the epiphysis is compact bone. The inside of the epiphysis is that spongy bone that we talked about just a second ago. This is a thin layer. There's also a thin layer of articular cartilage that is hyaline cartilage that's really tough that covers the surface of the epiphyses. The metaphysis is the area between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. That epiphyseal line or growth line is between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, and in childhood you can see the line in x-rays, but in adulthood there's only remnants of it, and that's where during childhood you'll actually grow the length of your bones from that epiphyseal line. It's a very sophisticated process. We'll talk about it though in a few minutes. The periosteum covers the external surface of the entire bone, and except for the joint surfaces. It's made of a dense connective tissue, and then on the inside of it, it's made of the osteogenic cells, those stem cells. And you have lots of nerve fibers in there, blood vessels. It's a very tough material, and the periosteum will grow into tendons and into ligaments so that bones can be connected to muscles and bones can be connected to bones. So it's a very, very tough, dense connective tissue. And dense connective tissue is going to have a lot of collagen fibers in it. Another part that we see oftentimes in bones, and I'll show you a better picture of it in a few minutes, are Sharpey's fibers or perforating fibers. And these are collagen fibers that secure the periosteum to the underlying bone. These Sharpey fibers are very important because they connect intimately the periosteum to the bone, so that when the periosteum moves, the bone moves. These things go together and work together as a unit. The medullary cavity is that hollow space within the diaphysis. It holds in adults the yellow marrow, blood vessels, and nerves. And then lining the medullary cavity is the endosteum, and this is a connective tissue which covers the internal bone surfaces. Again, it's made of osteogenic cells, so stem cells, so you can have some growth and some activity in there. There are all kinds of little spongy parts to spongy bone. These are called trabeculae, and the endosteum will cover all of the trabeculae, all the parts of spongy bone, and all the canals that go through the compact bone will be covered by endosteum. And this just shows you a beautiful picture of the long bone that we just talked about. And then it goes in and takes a little section here and shows you the trabeculae I just told you about, which is the internal configuration of the spongy bone. And you can see compact bone over here. Spongy bone and compact bone are very different substances, as we'll see as we talk a little bit more about it. Over here you can see that yellow marrow, so it's a little cylinder of yellow marrow. Whenever I find bones in the woods of dead animals, I will oftentimes see the long bones broken open, and the yellow marrow has been extracted by, the coyote or whatever predator has opened those bones up. That yellow marrow is very important to scavengers because it has lots of nutrients and lots of so lots of calories, and you know, for survival reasons you want to eat lots of calories, so you have lots of those in those bones. Bones are really good for you too, you know, if you eat bones, not necessarily eat the calcium part of the bones, but you know, if you boil a bone and get the bone marrow out, it's very nutritious. You can open a bone up and eat bone marrow, and it's a very nutritious, high in iron, and very important nutrient for animals out in the wild. Here's that endosteum I was talking to you about before. That's the inner lining of the medullary cavity. And you can see over here the periosteum, or bone skin. So it's the dense connective tissue making up the skin of the bone. And you can see little Sharpay's fibers actually in there, digging deep into that compact bone to connect that periosteum to the compact bone. And we see nutrient arteries that are feeding into this material. So when you tear the periosteum, you will feel that there are nerves and blood vessels. You know, there's bleeding when you break a bone because of all the blood vessels that enter into the bone. So speaking of blood vessels, you have lots of them. I won't make you memorize all these. I just want you to know that there are nutrient vessels that go in, and they feed all the interior of the bone. The bone is a living material. When you find a bone in the woods, you know, all that living material has been digested and decomposed, and you're just seeing the framework of it. But it's a living, growing, ever-changing, ever remodeling material. So this is just a beautiful picture of a bone cut in longitudinal sections. So you can see that medullary cavity and the diaphysis. You can see the compact bone, and you can see that wonderful, beautiful, spongy bone all around here. And there's a little epiphyseal line right there that you can see. That growth line is right there. So remember, inside of the spongy bone would be your red bone marrow that's going to be making your red blood cells. So when you look at a flat bone, so we've only talked about long bones. When you talk about a flat bone, such as the bones in your skull, they do have compact bone. As you can see in this little sandwich of bone, there's compact bone on either side, and then you have the diploe, which is the spongy bone in between. So that appears to be like a weak bone, but it's actually not. The trabeculae form almost like a truss. And will resist compression in many different dimensions. So you know, despite the fact that this is a thin bone, it's actually a very tough bone. I don't know how many times you've hit your head before, but it usually doesn't fracture the skull because of the strength of that arrangement. Your skull is also an arch. I don't know if you knew that, but it's an arch. So if you look at the front of the head, it's an arch, and an arch is a very, very, very strong. It's a very strong arrangement that we use to build bridges and other kinds of things, and your body used it to build a skull. So let me talk about compact bone for just a second. I'll go ahead and define a few parts, and then we'll look at some images of this. So your compact bone is made of repeating units, these repeating units called osteons. It's also called a Haversian system, but these osteons are repeating units inside of bone, and they're circular repeating units. So they're elongated cylinders that go parallel to the long axis of a bone. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. These the osteon is a series of concentric tubes of bone called lamellae. So you have layers in an osteon of lamellae. So each of these would be a lamellae, and a lamella, excuse me. And these basically will surround the Haversian canal, or this canal that's in the center of the osteon. This Haversian canal is going to serve as a passageway for blood vessels and nerves. And the lamellae, the lamella would be singular, lamellae is plural, are just beneath the periosteum, and they extend around the entire circumference of the bone. So you do have different kinds of lamellae. You have circumferential lamellae, which go around the entire surface of the bone, and then we have interstitial lamellae, which lie between intact osteons, filling spaces in between them. And again, I'm just kind of defining things for you. We'll flesh those out in a picture in a second. We have also perforating or Volkmann's canals. These lie at right angles to the long bone axis. So if the long bone axis is this way, you have canals working in this kind of way. And these will connect blood vessels and nerves of the periosteum to the central canals and then to the medullary cavity. Inside of the compact bone, we also have lacunae. Lacuna is singular. These are small holes that house the mature bone cells called osteocytes. And these are found at the junctions of the lamellae, as you'll see in a picture, and they connect each other to the central canal via a series of hair-like canals. So little caniculi, or these little hair-like canals, connect adjacent lacunae, which, since inside the lacunae there are osteocytes, all the osteocytes are connected together through these little caniculi, these little channels, where they can communicate information, share nutrients, and things of that nature. All right, now here's the picture you really need to be familiar with. And in lab, we'll have an opportunity to look at a model of this. You'll look at this under the microscope, and of course, you'll have several drawings that you'll be making of that. So let's go ahead and we'll look at the repeating unit. So here's the repeating unit right here. This is an osteon, and you can see here's an osteon right here. They're circular repeating units that are parallel with the long axis of the bone. They are a cylindrical unit. You can see the artist has pulled one of the cylinders out over here, so you can see that. You can see that this whole thing is an osteon. And you can see that it has repeating lamellae, or concentric arrangements of these tissues. In between the lamellae, you can see there are osteocytes in between those lamellae, and you can see the little caniculi, which are those little lines extending out from the osteocytes, so they can be, contact each other and stay in contact with each other and share nutrients. The central canal is in the middle, and that's where you have your blood vessels and nerves that are flowing through. So you do have concentric lamellae, and you have interstitial lamellae, so you can see the difference between those two things. And we do have trabeculae on the inside, where the endosteum would be, showing you some of that particular arrangement. We also have here Volkmann's canals, you can see, or perforating canals. They lie at right angles to the long axis of the bone, and these will communicate nerves and blood vessels into the central canal and communicate these between central canals. So it's absolutely an amazing and beautiful arrangement how these tissues are arranged. And one last part I didn't tell you what was the circumferential lamellae. Those go around the entire bone, and then you have the concentric lamellae making up the osteons, and then interstitial lamellae are going to be in between the osteons. So you make a unit that's very strong, very tough, and can withstand the stresses of providing structure and the stresses of muscles pulling on them. I'm not sure this has a lot to add to what we just talked about. It's a very similar figure, but I did like how you could see a blown up picture of the lacuna that this osteocyte is sitting in, and the caniculi. These are little channels through the bone with extensions of the cell membrane of the osteocyte moving through, and they will contact each other and share nutrients, information, and so they're even though they're trapped inside those lacunae, they still are in contact with all the cells that are around them. So this is just showing you the circumferential lamellae around the entire bone. I like this because it shows you the fibrous and cellular layer of the periosteum, that bone skin. So osteogenic cells would be in the cellular layer, lots of collagen fibers in that fibrous layer. You can see the little caniculi between the osteocytes. You can see an osteocyte in the lacuna. And here's those Sharpei fibers, those perforating fibers, extending from the periosteum down and digging into the compact bone. That right there, my friends, is a very strong unit. And it's very, very hard to tear that periosteum away from the bone. So the periosteum, if you remember me telling you just a second ago, will grow into ligaments and tendons. So that bone skin grows into ligaments and tendons, which connect bone to bone and muscle to bone. And again, it's very hard to tear that off of the bone. Here is just an osteon taken out of out to show you, and you can see they are concentric lamellae, concentric circles of the repeating unit material. When you look at the collagen fibers in each of the concentric circles, the collagen fiber matrix grows at opposite ways. That gives tremendous strength to these repeating units. So the way those fibers, those very, very strong fibers grow, are opposite of each other, or in different dimensions, so that it gives great strength to the compact bone. This is just showing a growth structure of a spongy bone and compact bone, just taking a beef bone and cutting it open so you can see inside of what it would look like. Now, spongy bone is not as organized. It's poorly organized compared to the compact bone, and it is made of those trusses called trabeculae. These align along lines of stress to help the bone resist stress, and there's no osteons that are present. They do contain irregularly arranged lamellae and osteocytes interconnected by caniculi. So you still do have some lamellae, not full-blown osteons though, with concentric lamellae in that same arrangement that you saw before in a compact bone. And there are capillaries in the endosteum that supply nutrients to these elements of the bone. So there is endosteum that will cover the spongy bone. And this is kind of what spongy bone looks like here. Here you can see the trusses, the trabeculae. If you take and what the artist has done here is they've taken and they're looking inside. They've kind of worn a piece off and they're looking inside of it. And you can see there are some lamellae, but there's no central canal. There are lacunae that the osteocytes sit in, and caniculi that are the little connecting channels between osteocytes. So you can see the osteocytes in the lacunae. Here's an osteoclast doing its job of degrading the bone. And then you have osteoblast on the outside surface there that will actually build new trabeculae. So if we look at a little section of spongy bone there, you can see those beautiful trabeculae. Again, those are growing against lines of stress to aid in the strengthening of the bone. The endosteum covers the whole surface of that bone. And you have little, lamellae that are inside, little concentric circles, but no central canal and no major organization compared to the compact bone. So there is a tissue, a hematopoietic tissue that's inside of bones called red bone marrow, and this occurs within the trabecular cavities of the spongy bone. And in some, when you look at young people, some of the long bones are going to have the red marrow as well. So our red marrow does change in its location throughout our lives. So in the flat bones, they're in the diploe of the flat bones. So that's the spongy bone inside the flat bones. And in infants, they're found in all medullary cavities. The red marrow is found in all medullary cavities, in all areas of spongy bone. Adults, we begin to restrict our production of blood cells to flat bones and the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and femur. So that spongy bone and the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and femur will have some red blood cell production, or some blood cell production within that red bone marrow. So if you ever have a bone marrow transplant, you have to open up bones and then extract the marrow out and then transplant that into another person. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll deal with bone development here. So bone development is also known as ossification or osteogenesis. And so bone tissue formation begins around the second month of development. And then postnatally, you have bones growing in length and remodeling and repairing of bone throughout a person's lifetime. So there's a couple types of this bone formation. The first type is called endochondral ossification, and this is where your bone develops from the replacement of a hyaline cartilage skeleton into bone. So when you are a fetus, you have bones. They look like bones, but they're made of hyaline cartilage. They're bone frameworks, and then the bones bone material will begin to grow in and replace the hyaline cartilage and break it down, and this is called endochondral ossification. We do have, as a fetus, endochondral bones, which are cartilage bones made of hyaline cartilage, and this forms most of our skeleton. So endochondral ossification will begin in a particular procedure. There will be these primary ossification centers that will occur in the hyaline cartilage skeleton of the fetus. So at certain parts of the hyaline cartilage skeleton in the shafts, you'll have this primary ossification center that will form. You'll have blood vessels that will come in. Now remember, hyaline cartilage isn't known for its blood vessels, so when you have a blood vessel infiltrate the hyaline cartilage material, it will begin to change the nature of the environment that the cartilage cells are sitting in. You'll literally change the perichondrium, so the cartilage material, into periosteum because of the environmental change due to the blood vessels infiltrating that area. If you change the nutrition, you can change what the cells actually do. And many of the cells will change to osteoblast, or bone building material. So we have to have blood vessels grow into that skeleton in order for a primary ossification center to develop, so we can change some of the cartilage cells into osteoblast and begin to build bone material. So this is just showing you in a simple diagram kind of what's going on. So we'll start down here at the bottom. So at the bottom here we have that there are cells here. The primary ossification centers are developing because you have nutrient arteries beginning to grow in it. The hyaline cartilage serves as the model for those bone cells to begin to grow in. The cartilage center of the diaphysis calcifies and develops cavities, so you begin to deteriorate the cartilage matrix and begin to build bone material. So we will have blood vessels that will begin to enter in, and spongy bone will begin to form inside of that medullary cavity. So the diaphysis will begin to elongate, so you get the lengthening of the bone material going through, replacing that cartilage skeleton. And then eventually we'll have a full-blown bone that's been replaced. Now you do hold some cartilage on the outside surface, the articular cartilage. It remains intact. And we do have a line on either side of the long bone of cartilage that will remain in place until your bones stop growing. This is where your bones, these epiphyseal plates or epiphyseal lines, will be where your bones will grow in length from. So you will continue to have that until you stop growing. Okay, so the cartilage skeleton is not completely replaced. You can see that it starts an ossification center over here and over here, but it leaves a little place to retain that cartilage there, so you can continue to grow the bones in length. This is just a picture taken of a 12-week fetus, showing you all the endochondral bones, the uncalcified bones that are there. So that's kind of cool that we have a complete skeleton. It's flexible, and then it turns to bone. So in this particular skeleton, you're starting to see calcification occur. The red areas represent the bones that are being calcified, but these areas that are not red represent places where calcification hasn't occurred yet. Okay, so another type of bone formation is intramembraneous ossification. And this is where your bones develop from a fibrous membrane. We also call this membrane bone. And this will be where you form bones like your flat bones, like your clavicles, which are right here, in your collarbone, and your cranial bones. These are formed from intramembraneous ossification. I don't know where I put my picture. So okay, so in this particular thing, inside of that fibrous material, you will begin to form ossification centers. Osteoblasts will secrete the bony extracellular material. calcification will continue and begin to harden that matrix. You will begin to form the trabeculae, and then you get full-blown compact bone and trabeculae that will form. Okay, so that occurs in the flat bones, and you just have a membrane there that will begin to ossify over time, and then form the complex arrangements that you're familiar with that flat bones have. Okay, so I want to talk about interstitial growth, the growth in the length of your bones. So in order for your bones to grow in length, you have to have that epiphyseal cartilage. The epiphyseal plate is going to be the thickness, constant thickness, and it's going to be where the new cartilage will grow and new ossification of bone will occur. So the rate of cartilage growth on one side of this plate will be balanced by the replacement on the other side. So your cartilage is going to grow, and then it's going to be replaced, but it's going to continue to grow and continue to be replaced and that's how your bones grow in length. And I'll show you some pictures of that in a second. So remodeling of the epiphyseal ends will occur continuously. So as you grow that bone in length, you also have to remodel the bone. Okay, you have to remodel the sides of the bone so the proportions will stay at a relatively constant rate. So bone remodeling has to occur at the same time in parallel with both bone growth and length. Okay, so when we look at this this cartilage, and I'll show you a good picture of it in just a second. When we look at this epiphyseal plate, there are going to be certain zones where cells will be doing different things in different cells. There's going to be a part of the cartilage that will be a quiescent or resting zone. There will be a proliferation zone where you'll have growth in the hyaline cartilage cells. There is a hypertrophic zone where the cells grow in size. Then we have a calcification zone where you begin to have bony material, the hydroxyapatite crystals begin to grow in, and then you have an ossification zone where bone is beginning to replace completely the cartilage. Okay, and this is a very complex and beautiful arrangement here. So you're seeing this little part of a long bone right there where your growth plate is, and this is showing you the way that the cells will be growing and moving. So we do have a resting zone. We then have a proliferation zone where the cartilage cells undergo mitosis, and we're going to be pushing those cells this way. We're going to have a hypertrophic zone where you have the cells are actually enlarging in size. Here we begin to calcify in this particular zone, and cartilage cells are going to die. You're going to have invading blood vessels and invading cells that will be osteoblasts. And then we have the ossification zone where a new bone will form. Okay, so all of that's occurring in that little thing, and this is what it looks like histologically. So this is showing you the bone as it's growing in lengthwise. You can see the resting zone is here, but it goes and it moves upward to here. So the proliferating zone is here, but it moves upward to here, and you have the hypertrophic zones moving up, and then this new calcification area is calcifying. So we do have a movement this way so that the bone is growing in length. So down here we have replacement. Here we're growing. Okay, and eventually this zone will ossify and you won't grow any longer. Okay, so that's occurring at the ends of your long bones. Occurring at the same time of bone growth, so you can see the growth here is remodeling. So here's what the old bone used to look like, but you have to remodel to make the proportions correct too. So not only are we growing in bone in length, but in girth we're beginning to change and digest the bone and reshape it to meet the demands of a different length in bone. Now near the end of adolescence, your chondroblasts, those cells that are forming the cartilage, are going to start to divide less often. the epiphyseal plate will thin and it will be replaced by bone completely. So when the epiphyseal plate closes, bone length ceases. Okay, so bone lengthening ceases. Bone material of the epiphysis and diaphysis will actually fuse. This occurs around 18 years of age in females and about 21 years of age for males. There are people who continuously grow throughout their lifetime where the epiphyseal plate doesn't close, and that forms gigantism, and usually that's controlled because of a pituitary gland tumor that's producing excessive amounts of growth hormone. So this is just showing a hand of a young person where they still have their growth lines. You can see the growth lines in the phalanges there, and these are the metacarpals, and you can see the growth line here in the let's see which bone that is. That would be the ulna. And here you can see they fused, so you don't see those growth lines any longer in this adult. So all of these have been fused. So appositional growth is the growth in bone girth, so kind of the width of the bone. This allows the bone to widen and occurs throughout your life. Osteoblasts that are beneath the periosteum, that bone skin, will secrete bone matrix on the external bone. So that allows it to grow in girth. Now, the osteoclast will remove bone from the endosteal surface, so that'll enlarge the medullary cavity. Usually, more building occurs than breaking down, and the thicker your bone is, the stronger the bone will be. Because we do have osteoclasts that are eroding the inside surface, it doesn't allow it to become too terribly heavy. So this is just showing you on the this is showing you bone skin out here. This is the bone skin, periosteum. This is a periosteum blood vessel, and you can see this is a perforating canal going through the bone skin, and there's a little groove that forms there. So I'm just showing you how new bone can form. You basically get a little tunnel that forms, so the periosteum will bend in on itself, forming a little tunnel, and that little tunnel will disconnect at some point in time, and the inside surface will become endosteum, and the outside surface will begin to grow into concentric circles. So now we have an osteon, and we have the concentric circles that are there. So kind of a cool little process that occurs to form bone on the outside surface to make that compact bone thicker and stronger. This is showing you changes from an infant to an adult, changes in the girth of the bone. You can see that the infant's bones are relatively thin. The medullary cavity will grow in size because the osteoclast will degrade it, but the thickness of the compact bone will get thicker and thicker. Now, if you lift weights and put stress on your bone, the compact bone will get even super thick, and that gives you resistance to bone breakage. So many athletes, even if they're not weightlifters, will lift weights to increase the girth of their bones to help them to withstand stresses placed upon the bones that would normally break them. So mechanical stressors applied to bone. A guy named Wolf a long time ago created a law that said when you put stress on your bone, the bone will actually grow. Okay, so when you put stress on your bone, this is a really good thing. That's why we tell old people that we want old people to lift weights, so that they put stress on their bones to make sure that they continue to grow in strength. This Wolf's Law will explain a lot of things. It explains that when you put stress on bones, it grows to that. It'll remodel and grow. But your right hand and your left hand are going to be different in terms of handedness. So if you're right-handed, your right hand bones are going to be thicker than your left hand bones because you're using it more prevalently. Curved bones are thickest where they're most likely to buckle because of the stress that's placed upon them makes them thicker. Trabeculae are formed stresses along the lines of stress. So Wolf's Law is explaining that if you apply stress to something, it's going to grow bone in that particular way. Large bony projections occur where heavy active muscle attachment occurs. So anywhere you put stress on a long bone, you're going to have these thickened parts where that muscle is connecting to that bone. And if you're a fetus or you're bedridden, your bones are featureless because there's no stress placed upon them. Therefore, there's no growths of the bone. And this is just showing you that there are, all kinds of stressors that are placed upon bone. You can see these projections here where strong muscles attach to the bones and place stress on them and they actually grow. There will be points of tension and points of stress. When our body load is placed here, this is where the bone compresses over here, and this is where it actually has tension that goes in these dimensions. So the bone thickness, you will actually notice that the bone thickness, if you cut this in cross-section, will be different based on the compression points and tension points from the weight of our body pressing on them. And then this lady here, vigorous exercise will grow. So this will be the serving bone of a tennis player, and this is the non-serving arm bone, the humerus. So you can see that that in cross section the bones will be thicker when you're placing more stress upon the bone. One of the neatest things I ever saw at the Smithsonian Institute, which is a museum that has a really excellent bone display, is they had all kinds of people's bones that did weightlifting, and they cut them in cross section. You could go and actually look at them and see all the different things that happen based on stress you place upon the bone. It's a really cool exhibit if you ever get a chance to go see that. Osteoporosis occurs when we have very little stress placed upon the bones, or we're not eating enough of the material, the calcium and things like that, or maybe not making enough vitamin D. This is what normal spongy bone looks like, and this is what osteoporotic bone looks like. And you can see that the matrix of the calcium crystals is just being dissolved there. In adults that have osteoporosis, it usually occurs in the vertebral, the spinal cord, and the vertebrae, and also the hip. And that's why when a lot of older people fall, they have hip fractures, or they have compression fractures where their vertebrae collapse because of the bone's not strong enough to resist the strain of gravity. What I think I'll do here is stop right here, and we'll continue the second part of the skeletal system in a separate lecture. So until then, I will see you then.